Good morning. It is an honor to be with you today, and I have to say thank you for the great welcome we've received. It's kind of interesting that when you have a name like Duer, you can't get away from it. And I've already had two stories of my grandparents today, and what a blessing that is. You know, when I saw Mark earlier, I thought, well, wait a minute, I know his son, because I go down to Robertsdale and I see him down there. So it's one of those things where he knows my dad and my mom, he knows my granddad, and now I know his son. That's those connections that we get. It's that belonging, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today. To begin with, I wanted to tell you that what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the Bible, and we're going to look at God's passion for the fatherless. That's not a part of God's characteristic we talk about a whole lot. But when you look at Scripture, it's crystal clear that He wants us to take care of those who are vulnerable. And it comes through over and over again. We're going to begin by looking at some of those scriptures. The first scripture is in Deuteronomy, chapter 10. Now this is after Moses has gotten the second tablet of the stones that have the Ten Commandments on them. And he's told them about that experience of getting that. And starting in verse 12 of Deuteronomy 10, it says, "Now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you, but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all of his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and the statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your own good. Behold, the Lord your God to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Yet the Lord sent his heart in love on your fathers, and chose their offspring after them, you above all people, as you are to this day. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn. For the Lord your God is God of gods, and the Lord of lords, the great and mighty and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing." Moses is describing God and says he's the Lord of lords, the God of gods, and he's a leader that takes no bribes. He has no partiality. And he executes justice for the most vulnerable of the people. You may wonder, why are widows and orphans often tied together so much in the Bible? Well, that's because women had very little power during these times. They often could not have property. And you notice it talks about the Pharisees asking Jesus, so if a man dies and has no kids, then his brother marries her and they have no kids, and that goes down 3 or 4 generations, whose wife is she going to be in heaven? Well, the reason for that law was to protect that woman, to make sure she had some man in her life to be that protector for her. So if you have a widow who has no father, brother, or husband, that's a very vulnerable person at this point in time. The same for a child who doesn't have that protection. So you'll see it uses fatherless a lot. We often think of an orphan as someone who's lost both parents. It's more common in the Bible. They're talking about a child who has lost their father and is fatherless because his mother or her mother could not take care of her either. Let's go back to Exodus to look at our next instance here. This is in Exodus 22. It's also a part of the telling of the law. And in verse 22, it says, You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with a sword. And your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Wow. God took that seriously. He wanted the widows and the orphans taken care of, and if you mistreat them, he was going to come after you. One of the passages we won't look at today, but I encourage you to look up on your own, is Isaiah chapter 1. In Isaiah chapter 1, God is telling the people, your worship literally stinks. I can't stand it. And he's telling them this not because they're doing worship wrong. It's because of how they're treating people. And he tells them in verse 17 of Isaiah chapter 1, stop doing wrong, do what's right, care for the orphan, the widow, and the sojourner in your land. That's the place he wanted them to begin getting their lives right, because they were taking advantage of the vulnerable, and therefore their worship was not being received by God. A couple of more Old Testament passages we're going to look at real quickly. The first is in Psalms. Psalms chapter 10, verses 17 and 18. O Lord, you hear the desire of the afflicted. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to do justice to the fatherless and the oppressed, so that the man who is of the earth may strike terror no more. And in the scripture we've already read, that I'm going to read again, is Psalm 68, verses 4 through 6. Sing to God, sing praise to his name. Lift up a song to him who rides through the deserts. His name is the Lord. Exalt before him. Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. God settles the solitary in a home, and he leads the prisoners to prosperity, but the rebellious dwell in a parched land. That image in verse 6 of God placing the solitary or the lonely in a home or in a family, what a beautiful picture that is. And that's some of the work that Agape gets to do, is vulnerable children find families through our work. The last verse that we're going to look at is the one that we probably memorized as a child somewhere along the way, James 1:27. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. I'm often reminded in the work that we do at Agape of the part of that verse that says, in their affliction. Because the work that we do is often messy. We often are dealing with the brokenness of the world very up close and personal. And we have to go where they're at to begin with. And those are some hard places sometimes. So I encourage you to pray for our staff, that as they're entering into those broken places, that God will protect their hearts from what they oftentimes see and hear as a result. The other reason I believe God has a passion for the vulnerable or for the fatherless is that he wrote them into the story. Now, when I was a kid, we had this high-tech device called flannel graph. Anybody remember flannel graph? At 10th Street in Opelika, at least to the second grade classroom, Jesus had been used so much he kept flopping over, so you had to keep smoothing him out to get him to stand up. But there was one Sunday you'd walk in, and you'd have baby Moses in the bulrushes, and you'd have Pharaoh's daughter come down to the river and adopt baby Moses. and give him the name Moses, which means drew him out of the water. And then the next Sunday you come to Sunday school, and you've got grown-up Moses over here in front of a burning bush. And sometimes people go, now wait a minute, how did he get from living in the palace to being in the wilderness? Well, this first story in the Bible of adoption tells us something important about it too, that identity matters. Because if you remember the rest of the story, when Moses is discovered and Pharaoh's daughter says, I'm going to take him home and take care of him, his sister pops up and says, would you like for me to get one of the Hebrew women to nurse him for you? And gets his mother to be able to take care of him. And that was probably a much longer time than we think of as a nursing mother. It was probably into his late toddler years that she still took care of him. So he knew who he was. And then also his name, the significance of being drawn out of the water, I bet you he heard that story over and over again. He knew he was a Hebrew child. So one day as a young man, he's walking along and he sees some Egyptians mistreating some Hebrews, and he kills the Egyptians. Despite being raised in Pharaoh's household, he still has identity as a Hebrew. The next day, he sees two Hebrews fighting. He says, guys, cut it out. And they go, what are you going to do, kill us too? And he realizes he really doesn't have a place to belong. So he goes on a bit of a journey, and he spends 40 years tending sheep, which was just a really long internship to spend 40 years tending God's sheep. God wrote adoption into the story through Moses. The next story we see vulnerable children and hurting families is the story of Joseph. I've got two brothers, one that's a little bit older than me and one that's way younger than me. And we fought. We did things that probably weren't nice. My older brother and I taught our younger brother mouth, nose, ears, and eyes. That's what happens when you leave a younger child with older brothers. But we didn't sell him into slavery. That's what happened. That's a dysfunctional family. God wrote that into the story. The next example that I think of is Samuel. Hannah longed for a child. And when she received the child that she longed for, she gave that child back to God, and he was raised by Eli. And it says Hannah only saw him once a year. But she still took care of his needs, even though he was not there with her. I think about the impact Samuel had on the story and how he wasn't raised by his parents. God wrote him into the story. And the final one, Mark actually referenced during Sunday school, the story of Esther. She's being raised by a relative, not by her parents. And if you think about what that story's about and what she was asked to do, she was in a very vulnerable position as a very young person. And I like to think that the story of Mordecai challenging her with his words of, how do you know you're not here for just this time, is a great example of how intergenerational believers should interact with each other. He's challenging her to step up for what she is called to do. And her response is, okay, here's what I need you to do for me. I need you to get all the Jews that are here to pray for 3 days and fast for 3 days. And they did it. What a neat combination that he's challenging her, he's raising the bar for her, and she asks and he carries it out. What a beautiful picture that is. So we know that God tells us He's passionate about the vulnerable. And then he writes the vulnerable into the story. So what does that have to do with agape? Well, our mission at Agape is that as a ministry of Jesus Christ, our mission is that vulnerable children will find permanency in safe, nurturing families. Okay, it's a big word, permanency. What does that mean? It means belonging. It's that belonging that I get from hearing stories of my grandparents and my parents. It's the belonging we get from having connection to family. Another way I look at belonging is when I was a little boy, my mom's family lived on Lookout Mountain outside of Fort Payne. And second Sunday in June was family reunion, the Harrison family reunion. We'd go up there, and inevitably, at some point in time, probably on my third time through the dessert line or something, some little old lady would look at me and say, "Who do you belong to?" And I would say, "Well, I'm Sally Kay's son." And I had belonging because I had an answer to that question. Our mission is that every child will have an answer to that question, who do they belong to? Not just an earthly answer, but also an eternal answer to that question as well. I'm going to give you just a little overview of how we carry out that mission as we wrap up our time together. The first is through walking alongside vulnerable mothers and pregnant women who are in crisis. I've got a chart on the table out in the foyer that highlights the growth in our maternity program over the last 2 years. When the Dobbs decision came down from the Supreme Court in June of 2022 that made Roe v. Wade no longer the rule of the land, now states could make their own laws, and Alabama chose to end abortion in Alabama. That year, we served 36 expectant mothers in crisis. The next year, we served 65. And last year, we served 73. We're seeing more and more women reach out for help because they don't feel like they have anywhere else to turn. And the things that we're seeing more and more are the complexity of the cases are getting more complex. We're seeing more women who are involved in domestic violence situations. We're seeing more women who, this is not their first child. They just can't figure out how they're going to parent another child. Over half the women that we serve are already parenting other children. The interesting thing is that our adoption numbers have not gone up with this. People are a little surprised by that when I say that our adoption numbers haven't gone up. Most of the women we serve choose to parent the child still. But again, our mission is permanency. And if we can help that mother feel comfortable and confident and able to raise that child never enters the child welfare system, we've achieved the mission of permanency. What we have found, though, is oftentimes the reason the mothers come to us is not because of financial reasons. That may be the surface reason, but the underlying reason is a lack of support in community. A couple of years ago, we had a mom who made a parenting plan with us, and I was actually the one who worked with her a little bit. Now, let me tell you, if I'm carrying the phone, that's like having your third string quarterback in the game. I should not be carrying that phone very often, but we had some folks on vacation, so I took the phone, and she answered. She called, and I answered, and she was in a broken. Are we going to need to change microphones? I'm good. Okay. She was in a broken place. The day before, something had happened where she had been living, and she was kicked out in the middle of the night with her 20-month-old baby. And she found a place for the baby to stay, but she slept on the streets that night because they wouldn't accept her, just the baby. She got up the next morning. She called a cab to go pick up the baby, she took the baby to daycare, and took herself to work. That cab ride ate up most of what she was going to make that day. But her words to me were, I knew I had to do that because if I don't work, nothing good happens for anybody. The more we talked, the more I understood why she was in the situation she was in. This young lady was 20 years old. Her mother was 34. Do the math. She was raised by a child herself. This lady had a lot of things going for her. We were able to support her and help her get to the place where she could parent. And then a year later, she reaches out to us again. I happened to answer the phone again. She called our office and I answered the phone. And she said, y'all helped me a year ago. And I said, hey, this is Steve. And she said, do you remember me? I said, oh, I remember you. And she said, the baby has to have eye surgery in Birmingham. This is in the middle of the pandemic. And she said, Ronald McDonald House has limited capacity. I need help with a hotel room or with rent. I can't pay for both. Well, we talked more, and she had a voucher that was going to reduce the cost of the hotel room, but it was still too much for her to pay. It was about $250. And she's the same age as my son. And I immediately started thinking, if my son needed $250, who could he call? And I ran out of fingers real quick. And it broke my heart that this lady's response to that need was to call Agape. I'm glad we were there, though. And thanks to a church partner in the Birmingham area, in a 10-minute phone call, that hotel bill was taken care of. And she didn't have to worry about the hotel bill anymore. And the surgery was successful, and the baby's doing well. But think about that network you have and that your kids have access to, and what you would do if you didn't have that. And that's why Agape gets involved in many of the women that we serve to meet some of those needs. Another quick story I'll share with you is we had another mom who made an adoption plan with us. And about a year after the adoption plan, we were still working with her on some things, and she reached out to her worker and said, listen, I'm in community college now, but I've got to get out of this town because everybody here is trying to pull me down, and I want to do things. I want to go to a 4-year school, but I don't have a way to get to college visits. Will you take me on college visits? And my worker said, absolutely. So they went on a college visit. I don't know if you've been on a college visit in the last 4 or 5 years. It's different than back in 1984 when I went on my college visit. My college visit was, oh, here's the campus, walk around, okay. If you want to come, here's the paperwork to fill out. We'll see what we can give you. Now you roll up to Faulkner University in front of the business building there, and they have reserved parking spaces that they put kids' names on when they first get there. This 4-year college had the same thing, and she walked in there and saw her name on the parking place, and then they got the fancy golf cart with the curtains on the side and took her on a tour around campus. And she looked at our worker and said, I'm going to do this. Well, last August, she asked our worker to go with her and her mother for transfer student orientation and move-in day. And she is about to complete her first year at a 4-year school. Even if she doesn't graduate, she has changed her family's life by going to college, because we know that that has an economic impact. Just going to college has an economic impact. But not only has her child's life trajectory been changed through the adoption, her trajectory has been changed, and any children she has after this will be changed as well. We're only able to do that because of the support that we receive from people here and other places. So I've talked a lot about moms. Let me tell you about our adoption ministry. We seek families who have a ministry heart and a ministry mindset. The way we put it when we're talking to a family initially is we're looking for families for children, not children for families. If the family wants somebody to go out and find them a baby, we're not the right agency. That's not what we do. We're there to have families available in case a mom can't parent, that she can then choose from those families to be the best one. And I was meeting with one of our adoptive families a couple of weeks ago, and they have an open relationship. We tell all of our families there's really no such thing as a closed adoption anymore, even if you think you could do that. Social media and 23andMe and other genetic testing, you can find a family member just like that. So there really isn't closed adoption anymore. So we require open to some level of openness, at least communicating through the organization. But this family has an open relationship with the child's birth mother. And the adoptive mother was telling me that they were texting that day, this is in January, about the child's birthday and what the theme was going to be for his second birthday party. That's going to happen in June, because the birth mother's so excited about being a part of his second birthday. What a beautiful picture of the redemptive part of adoption, that this mom who couldn't parent is still getting to be a part of that child's life. I will tell you that we continually need ministry-minded families who are willing to come alongside moms to be adoptive parents. Right now, we have a good number of families on our waiting list, but we don't have families that don't have any children already. And that's something moms often prefer. So we would be interested in talking to folks. You might be interested about that. The final way we carry out our mission is through foster care. And this is one of those things that I just get amazed at our foster parents and the ministry that they do to the most vulnerable and the most broken. And the story I like to share that sums this up and why it's ministry. We had a 15-year-old young man who was referred to us, and the DHR worker said, listen, he just needs a good home. He's a good kid. He just needs somebody to love on him. And I've been around long enough to know that 15-year-olds who are in foster care, that's rarely the picture. So it's like, okay, we want to meet this young man. So we met him, and a foster family met him, and they agreed to give him a shot. And after he'd been in the home about 6 months, he had a court date coming up. And this young man was he was smart. He had looked into the law, and he knew that the law of Alabama says that at age 16, the judge can emancipate in unusual situations. So his plan was to go to court and ask for the judge to emancipate him and make him an adult at age 16. Now, I don't know about many of you guys, but I wasn't ready to be an adult at 16. And I don't know many 16-year-olds who truly are ready to be an adult. And this young man was not ready to be an adult. But when he shared his plan with the foster mother just reached across the dining room table, put her hand on top of his hand, and said, honey, if you leave this house, I'm going to come look for you, find you, and bring you back. And he said, what? And she said, if you leave this house, I'm going to come look for you, find you, and bring you back. Because if you stay here, good things are going to happen to you. If you leave, I don't think good things are going to happen to you. If you stay here, you're going to finish high school. If you leave, you're not going to finish high school. And the foster mother said he got up from the table with a smile on his face. You're thinking, he just got told no. Why is he smiling? Because he had just had reflected to him God's love that pursues, that says, I'm going to come after you. It's that prodigal son's father sitting on the porch looking that Jesus tells in the parable. That's what this foster mom was showing. Well, that young man did stay and had 3 good years of living in that foster home and being a part of a church youth group. And he graduated high school. Now, as soon as he graduated, that night, he decided he was ready to be independent. But he stayed through graduation. And his life will be better because of that. And we don't know what seeds were planted in his life that are going to be long-term successes for him. I often say that's a lot of what we're about, is we're planting seeds. And we don't know where that's going to be. There's another passage that's really stood out to me lately. It's in Luke chapter 2. You've got Jesus just been born. Mary and Joseph are in the manger with the child. And the shepherds have just come to see Jesus. And as the shepherds are amazed by what they've seen and what they've heard, they go tell everybody. And Luke says this phrase, "But Mary treasured these things in her heart." And then later in Luke chapter 2, toward the end of Luke chapter 2, they've gone to Jerusalem when he's 12, and he gets lost for 3 days. Sounds like something I would do. Wander off and nobody know where I'm at. Well, they find him. And it talks about Jesus growing in wisdom and stature and favor with God and favor with man. But it says Mary treasured these things in her heart. And as I read that, I really thought, isn't that what every child deserves? To have somebody who treasures them in their heart? Somebody who loves them? And that's the thing I love about churches. Because at churches, you get more than just your parents who treasure you. You get those individuals who stand with a bowl of candy to make sure the kids feel welcomed. They're the ones who have neat nicknames for kids as they come in. I'll never forget growing up, Billy Leopard called me Steve Areno every time I walked in. I don't know why he called me Steve Areno, but I was Steve Areno to Billy Leopard. And times I may not have liked that, but boy, I'd give anything to hear that again. There's people as a part of churches that make a difference. And one of the things that we've been working on as well, not only recruiting families to help, but recruiting churches to help the families who are fostering in their church so that those families can be supported and those children are supported. Here's the thing about that idea of being treasured. The idea of being treasured isn't unique to just Mary. See, there's another passage that most of us know. It says that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. God treasured us so much that he sent his son. Agape's ministry is to mirror God's love. And the great thing is that love is available for anybody. So today, if you've not experienced God's love, let me tell you, it's something special. And there's a chance for you to take advantage of it by being baptized today, making a confession of faith and being baptized today and repenting. And then there's also, if you've wandered away, if you're like that prodigal son, God's waiting for you to come back, and he treasures you and wants to see you come back. I'm sure this church would love to help you in any way possible. If you would come while we stand and sing.